Well, hello out there. I'm Robert Delfino. I'm chairing this session, and it's my great pleasure to introduce John Lyle, who will be speaking to you in a moment. John works at the Priority Thinking, which is a leadership development firm, and he works with Peter DeMarco, who many of us here know and love. John's an attorney. He specializes in intellectual property and contracts. He's the former headmaster of the St. John Bosco Elementary, and now they have a high school division. And he's going to speak to you about Frank Sheed as an apologist and a reformer. It's all you, John.
Let's see. So can we get the TV in there? Make sure we're working. Okay, great. Well, yeah, thank you for this opportunity here. I'm going to talk very briefly here about Frank Sheed as a ragamuffin apologist here. We're going to use the polling, and then hopefully I'll just introduce you to his work and what he was about. And I'm sure many of you may know and love him as well here. So we'll talk about him. The ragamuffin apologist sort of comes from Peter's, of course, inspired by Peter's book, the third volume of his trilogy there. And really the context of this talk came about because initially, I don't know if you remember, when Peter was issued his first call for papers, there were folks interested in Chesterton and Belloc and Lewis and maybe doing some of that. It's a bit out of context now, but I think you'll find a connection to Augustinian apologetics and reform here as we wrap up. So So let me give you the context here, though, of the talk. So the picture up here is so those are three of my kids, and so the guy in the middle, they're in a summer track program here, and there's from the age of 4 all the way up to 16, 18, I think maybe a few of them are. But the little guys, the young guys, they're just learning how to run. They're falling down. They're just kind of they're stumbling, but they're so pleased to be out there. And so the context of this whole talk really is so I am in this room and in the Thomas is I am sort of the Thomas. I am the young kid here. I'm just excited to be here. And really, so this particular talk is just I just want to just kind of introduce you a little bit. It irks me that when we talk about the Catholic revival in England and some of the things going on in the 20s and 30s and 40s and these great Catholic thinkers, Frank Sheed gets left out a lot. And so we'll explore Frank Sheed, but we're going to focus more on the how than the what. I'm not an expert. I'm not a theologian. We're going to focus on the how, not the what. So let's do the polling. Yeah, I do. Now this is, so the polling now is really just to help me understand how much you know about Frank Sheed, and actually it'll walk us or sort of drive us through the first part of the talk here, which is, again, it's going to be brief because Peter's the main event, but just want to know about how much you know about Frank Sheed. Again, we're going to do some demographic polling here first, though, so please, what's your primary discipline, field of study? Where do you do primarily, where do you work? As Mark said, how do you introduce yourself? Yeah.
Exchange this. Run out of battery.
Okay, so we've got 15 and 15. Everybody in? Okay, so 16 folks. We'll close that. Okay, about the same split as last time. Although there was a business person last time, an econ business. So somebody switched allegiances there, but right. All right, so my family constellation, I'm considered firstborn, middle of the pack, lastborn. Okay, let's see. We got 12 out of 16, 14 out of 16 last call. Okay, 17. Yeah, did you want to do the dogs and cats? I left it out this time. I felt foolish doing it. Okay, all right. So that's where he said. All right, now here's the meat of it. So just to help me understand where we are, how familiar are you with Frank Sheed, and who knows who Frank Sheed is? And so very familiar, somewhat familiar, vaguely, and not at all familiar.
Okay, good. So a quarter of you aren't at all familiar. So let me start there then. So broad brush overview. Frank Sheed was a publisher, and they did much more, and I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. But Sheed and Ward, I don't know if you've heard of Sheed and Ward Press. It was England and here in the United States. A lot of started in 1926, and for nearly 50 years, published a lot of Catholic books on theology, history, some novels, and so that's roughly who Frank Sheed was. But if you type in Frank Sheed in a Google search, you'll come up with a few of his titles here, which we'll get into in a minute. But they're sort of old standbys in the basic apologetics. So Frank Sheed grew up in Australia, England, Scotland, the United States. All right, 12, 17, 15, 16. All right, so England. So 70% of you said England, 6% Australia, 13% Scotland, 13% United States. So actually Frank Sheed is from Australia. So he grew up in Australia. So it's just kind of setting you up. I'm sorry? Yeah, yeah. So it's interesting. Frank Sheed's background, Australia at that time, had a fairly strong church, and it was primarily expatriate, or Irish priests that they shipped out. Now, Frank Sheed, though, and his family growing up, his father was a communist, his mother was a devout Catholic, and his aunts and his secondary family system were all Methodists. So he had so he'd been accused throughout his career as an apologist of being brainwashed. But he said, if you knew of all the different soaps in my brain right now, based on what I was growing up with, you'd know that argument would never stand. What's that? Yeah, is he from Australia? I didn't realize he was. Okay. All right. So next one. He's trained as a journalist, lawyer, philosopher, theologian. Okay, 17. All right, journalist, lawyer, philosopher, theologian. Okay, right. Well, so quarter of you are right. He was a lawyer. So he's trained as a lawyer in Australia, in the system in Australia. Got on a boat in 1920 for a trip to England. Ended up spending 4 or 5 years there, and which is when he got married and he started Sheed and Ward. He got married to Maisie Ward, whose father was a big figure in the Wilfrid Ward was a big figure in the Catholic revival, the English Catholic revival in the early 20th century. And then they asked him, "Why'd you get into publishing?" He said, "Well, because it wasn't practicing law." And so that's what. So that's how Frank Sheed ended up in. Anyway, just a couple more questions here, and then just so that you get a little background on it, relative to others in the Catholic revival. So this is like the Lewis and the Belloc, Christopher Dawson. So those three in the middle there, Dawson, Belloc, and Chesterton, Sheed Moore published a lot of their books. And so very important just kind of getting them a platform, so to speak, to get there. All right, 15 out of 17. Okay, yeah, good. So contemporary. Actually, it's a bad question I asked because it actually depends which guy you're talking about. So Chesterton and Belloc, he was 20 years older then. Dawson, Tolkien, Lewis, he's roughly a contemporary within a couple of years of both of those. Of course, now everybody's talking about Lewis and Tolkien, even into the, even in across faiths, Catholic, Protestant, with all that, with their novels and things coming to the big screen. Nobody, of course, is talking about Frank Sheed, but I'm going to tell you why we should be, at least to some extent. So now, last thing. This is the last question, I promise. His first job was off the boat in England. What was his first job? Just so that we know, he's a classroom teacher, editor, freelance author, soapbox speaker. Okay, 13 and 17. Okay, editor, teacher. Okay, so somebody said soapbox speaker. So actually, that's right. So he got off the boat. Somebody coming to England. Somebody offered him a job. He heard of something called the Catholic Evidence Guild, which where so essentially they set up a soapbox in Hyde Park and actually around London and would just they give talks. They would try and bring the faith to folks. But the thing about it was, and this is why it was so influential on him, you had to sort of create your audience. Of course, you get up on your soapbox, you create your audience, and so that was, he called it his eclectic school of theology. So he went on, and started doing it in the early 20s and published all the way up to, I think his last book was in the late 70s. So that 50 years, he says, was shaped by the Catholic Evidence Guild. So real quick, here's what I just want to get into. We really, frankly, covered the parts of his career, I think, that are key. I just want to tell you a little bit about his approach. You could see it in his books, but I think he's got some great. He published. It's about a 400-page volume of Catholic apologetics, and it's a lot of it's outlines, but there's great practical lectures on how do you get up there and preach the faith to a crowd. How do you get the crowd, and how do you keep the crowd, and how do you form them? Provide the little bit of formation that you can expect in a talk. So that's really, I guess, what I want to focus on today. Again, won't spend too much time, and then just kind of a so what coming out of it. So what's a ragamuffin, and then why do I? Right. Yes. Yeah, and so why do I? What's that?
That's not a ragamuffin.
Right.
This is a soapbox preacher,
right? Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So anyway, so this is so out of Bill McVeigh, of course, wrote the foreword to Peter's third book on ragamuffin Thomism there, and talked a little bit about what a ragamuffin was. Something of a misfit, street smart, shabbily clad. I don't know that Frank Sheep was shabbily clad, but wanders about looking for other ragamuffins to share in a common purpose. And so she then. Let's see. I guess I get the fade effect on this too. But so she 53 years speaking on soapboxes, and what he loved about it, he called it humanity in the rough. So he was going out to meet humanity in the rough, and I think you could see that in his books. You could certainly see that in in his approach to speaking, and it's just the varied characters that came his way, the hecklers, and they're about it. And so there's another point there that's not showing up is with Sheed and Ward. He said over the course of our existence, our main focus was that great mass of Catholic humanity. It was not, it wasn't the elite, the academic elite. It was that great mass of Catholics. And then, he sort of admitted that we had to create our own audience, both as a publisher and as I'm sorry here, it's locked up for me for some reason. So let me just skip through it. Okay. All right. So what's the problem that he was trying to hit? And let me just hit these quick. So the church has a siege mentality. So this is where the reference to the Reformations and this in Catholic apologetics or the apologetics of the new Reformations. That's why I think Sheed is relevant here because so in the 20s, one of the things that his father-in-law, was Williford Ward, said was the church has a siege mentality. And so just to read you a bit about, and he said, thinking on the Mass and the sacraments have suffered because we're concentrating too closely on these arguments, on winning the argument and not on not on advancing the faith. And so, and as Belloc said, I think he said it actually in a different context, but an ingrained habit of the defensive is a prime condition for defeat. So he's really focused on moving apologetics into an offensive mindset and taking it out there. And of course, Chesterton and Belloc being a big part of that. He also said Christ is in eclipse. And so he wrote a great book, Theology and Sanity, where he said sanity doesn't mean living in the same world as everyone else. It's living in the real world. And so he saw a great divide in society as with Christ in eclipse, very less important in people's lives. So he saw that as a big problem because now we've got two societies effectively. A man who accepts the faith is on almost another planet as one who doesn't. So he just saw that as a great problem. And then proof is in eclipse. So this, as I got into some of the research on Frank Sheed, I thought a lot about Robert's talk last year about the theology of nuns, and then published in the in the Gilsonia volume here. But I think in a lot of ways today we face this problem, is that proof is in eclipse. It's not the principal weapon anymore. It's always so proof is always wasted on a man who's not interested in the question. And of course, he uses the example of forgiveness of sin and confession. And of course, those things aren't really important to somebody who doesn't really care much about sin. So that's sort of the backdrop. And so here are 5 rules, and this is I guess essentially what I've got here for you today. Just to kind of keep in mind is as we go through, or what are his 5 rules? What did he develop? What did he learn on the street corner as an apologist that we can sort of bring forward and think about here today? So the first 3, 1, create a crowd and try and like it, of course. And so you said a disorganized mass is not a crowd. It's formed by a community of interest, by the turning of thoughts and feelings in a common direction. And so the first task is to somehow figure out how to create a crowd. What is the common interest? Find the common interest that we can focus on. And then proof is in eclipse. It doesn't work a lot of times. It gets argumentative. So the focus on exposition. So this was really the fascinating thing to me, and it relates, I guess, to another of this rules, which I've sort of created out of. I don't think he would have said these aren't his 5 rules. I sort of extrapolated, but so this direct work is to make us hear, see what the doctrines are. So you're sort of holding it up and not trying to win the argument. You're holding it up because argument is dangerous. So this whole idea of exposition, there's 2 things. He called it a simplification of the intellect and the will for the apologist. The intellect, you got to focus. What are you talking about? And then the will is he continually goes through it. And a lot of his works, it comes up, the dangerous element about argument is that you focus on victory. So he says the gravest temptation, lying in wait for the layman on the platform, for the apologist, is argument. Victory becomes the objective. If you talk about victory, sooner or later you cheat, as a great line of his. And then, of course, the work in hand is to convince an immortal soul of a truth that might make the difference of salvation. And so, of course, wasn't against argument, sort of had certainly laid out the faith in a very detailed way. But it's sort of an objective, a detached argument. And so the 4th one, and this actually was the most interesting one, I guess, for me, was this idea of the fact that he trusts the truth. So this idea of focusing on argument as opposed to proof. You got to trust the truth, because so as I said, he talked about it being a simplification for the intellect, because you could focus, and for the will, because you could sort of pull out the argument and the striving for victory instead of souls. But one of the striking things about all of his work is you trust in the truth. He just felt the will's attraction to the good is really what he relied on a lot. And of course, with the 5th point there, and prayer, this whole background of prayer, part of the reason you can trust the truth is, of course, is because of we're all created beings and drawn towards our Creator. And so the prayer, he said the work has to have a background of prayer. You should spend as much time before the Blessed Sacrament as you spend on an outdoor platform. So those are kind of his 5 rules that sort of guide his writings. And then I think to some extent can serve as some battle tactics, I guess, for this for apologetics here on the front line today. And so then the so what? So there's a striking passage in one of his books on theology where he talks about we're surrounded by starving by people who are starved for the food of Christ and they're not getting it, but we're not losing any sleep over it. We would be if they were hungry, if they were physically hungry. But the key point is that he's saying if the spiritual starvation is to be relieved, it's got to be the work of the laity. We're in daily contact with these starving victims, with these folks who need Christ, and so it's on us. That's the so what. And then the last point here is that they must see God. So as we're thinking about apologetics and the theology and the philosophy behind it, the focus always has to be on they must see God. It's holding up. I guess that we've got the picture of the monstrance there because, of course, in the monstrance you're just holding up our Lord. It's just a complete focus on Christ, and so I think that was a big thing for him. As much as he wrote volumes and volumes and volumes of books, the focus on our Lord was big. So so let me try and somehow connect it to what's coming up next is Peter's talk here on Augustinian apologetics and how it's not sufficient. I think, so interestingly, Frank Sheeb, I think would agree. So he says, I came to Augustine having read Aquinas first, and I think that's the only way you can really do it properly. But he made he translated the Confessions in 1942. There was an English translation from the mid 1800s, I think. It was from the folks with Newman and it wasn't Newman, but it was some folks in the Oxford movement there who translated the Confessions. But he is in the early 40s brought it sort of into the consciousness of certainly an American audience back into it. And so there's great stories of him. The way he did it was sort of on the subway. He loved Latin, and so on the subway on his ride into work in the morning and on his ride back home, he would just translate these little pages, and then he'd get to work, and then he'd dictate it to his secretary because he really wanted to ensure the sort of the lyricism, I guess, of the Confessions and make sure that he captured the beauty of the Latin. I can't speak, I can't read Latin, so I don't know if he captured it or not. But but it really is a striking. It's a great translation. He said St. Augustine is one of the 6 biggest influences of his life. He had essentially contemporaries: Chesterton, Bullock, Dawson, Ronald Knox was another of his contemporaries. But the 6th biggest influence of his life, he contributes to St. Augustine. So and here's why. Here just so the italics are just some things that he said about Augustine, and but I think the essential piece really is that all men of turbulent passions recognize him for a brother, and the reason that was important is because we all have turbulent passions. Or I think you would argue, we're all to some extent, to a greater or lesser extent, disintegrated. After the fall of man, our faculties are at war with each other, and Augustine, of course, with his famous "My heart finds no rest until it rests in you," and some of that sort of helps men find, and women, of course, figure out what the end is, but also he's been through it, and so so in the experience of the life of Augustine, he learns certain truths. He does not skim the truth off the experience and gives us that. He gives us truth in the concrete experience in which he lived it, and I think that's key to. That's one of the things that Augustine learned on, or that Frank Sheed learned on the platform there, and one of the reasons Augustine was so important to him. So that's it. I just thank you for putting up with that, and I appreciate the opportunity to have been here and presented.
All right. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Redpath. Now, among this crew, he doesn't need any introduction, but you have to understand, I grew up in New York with Peter, and I have to give him one. Otherwise, I might end up floating in the East River, something like that. But this presents a problem. How can I sum up all the contributions to philosophy and Thomism that Peter has made throughout the years? It's a daunting task. So here's the best that I can come up with. Peter is a third wave, free agent, born again, organizational, virtual quantity, philosophical genius, and thoroughly ragamuffin Thomist. Loved for his virtue, feared because of his powerful intellect. Peter is the lion of Aquinas Leadership International. Listen to him, or else.
Before starting, I wanted to comment on that terrific presentation that John Lyle gave. I thought that was absolutely magnificent. One of the things I wanted to focus on was that notion of a crowd. because that's St. Thomas's notion of a genus. To the extent that you want to communicate with an audience, the individuals have to sense that they're on the same page, in the sense that you're talking about the same topics, and you can't do that except to the extent that you have some sort of an aim, an interest that is commonly shared. So you have to unify the multitude into an organizational whole, and then you can ask questions that are related, that are of interest to the people, because they're qualified. They've now become qualified members of the same organization. And the reference to ragamuffin, initially, as I said, I was thinking about this as a kind of born-again Thomism, but when Bill McVeigh suggested to me, he said, ragamuffin Thomism is better in a way. And it is to some extent, but it gets people confused. And when I was reading St. Thomas's commentary on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and toward the end of the commentary, the last couple of books, he starts to talk about a distinction between virtue formation habits and virtue possessed habits, and in relationship to happiness, and two different pleasures that are related to them, and how these are connected to science, because the person who's developing science, or developing a philosophical habit, or any kind of habit, experiences certain pleasure in becoming maturely developed in the possession of the habit, and is operating between two contraries of success and failure. Right? But the person who's on the top of the game, right, doesn't think about failure. Right? And this relates to the church's siege mentality, in a sense. It goes back to the French Revolution. They still haven't fully recovered, from the shock of the French Revolution to some extent. And how to be successful in apologetics, the proper apologetics for our age, we have to get rid of that siege mentality. You need to engage in the offense, and you have to start out with the recognition that you are not fully possessed of a perfect understanding of Aquinas. Right? We never achieved it, and some people think, well, we achieved it in the 20th century. No, we never achieved it. We hadn't achieved it in the 19th century. We were missing principles, and we increasingly gain more principles. And so I thought, well, this third wave movement that we're involved in is moving the ball again with respect to Thomism, and recognizing, hey, these people were great geniuses in the 20th century, 19th century. They helped us to see, like stand, as St. Bernard of Chartres says, stand on the shoulders of giants, and you can see a little further than they did regarding the principles that we need. And one of these principles is the principle of induction. One of the major mistakes that Thomists have had was to think of induction like logicians have thought of it. It's this transition from this particular concept to a universal concept. When induction related to a real genus is being able to walk into a room, and recognize the parts of the whole, right? Recognize the kind of whole that you're dealing with, and the extent to which they excel at being a whole, what they are contributing. This is why for Aristotle there are these different qualities, different kinds of induction. And if we think about induction in terms of this logical conception of induction, you don't have the kind of induction that an organizational expert has, an organizational genius. They'll come on the scene, they'll see something, they'll recognize, hey, something's terrible. Even that this place is magnificent. This is running like a well-oiled machine. I know what type of organization I'm dealing with. And that's the kind of training that you have to develop within your allies. But the first thing to engage that they have to develop in order to take the offensive is to convert your allies. Because when you start to talk to them about this understanding that you have, which is something radically different from the way they're used to. In fact, I remember Eduardo when we were first talking, with Fulvio. And Fulvio, by the way, he sent me an email. He said to say hi to everybody. Fulvio de Blasi, he is our colleague from Palermo in Sicily, a lawyer, no doubt. And but also, you might be familiar with Fulvio's work down in North Carolina. And we appeared to be in total disagreement about what St. Thomas was saying, until we started to focus attention on the principles that we're looking for, that we could agree on. And then we started to see, actually, that there was this commonality, but it wasn't, it didn't seem to be recognized as such. So that's why I'm referring to this as ragamuffin Thomism, because I see us as developing a new conception of the teaching of St. Thomas, based upon principles that were neglected, but are crucial to understanding the formal object of a science, and how it relates to the faculties of a human person. In fact, Father Maurer talks about this in his work on the unity of science, and how Occam had prepared the way for Descartes by removing the formal object from being what today we'd call an external stimulus, some sort of an organizational whole that is activating a faculty. And he turned that into propositions. And in doing that, he basically turned philosophy into a kind of systematic logic. And that eventually led to an elimination of the habits of the soul needed to grasp the organizational principles of things, which is this realist induction. And that realist induction is related to the faculty of cogitative reason, or particular reason. So that kind of connects a bunch of the things we've been talking about before. And this has to do, the crucial, a devastating effect of this has to do with losing our sense of identity and of leadership. And my talk about why Augustinian apologetics and logical dialectic are not enough rationally to defend the reasonableness of the Christian faith is related to the fact that they can't help us precisely to understand the nature of the identity crisis from which we're suffering in the contemporary age. Contemporary culture, Christian culture, exists within a condition of severe identity crisis. I had written about this in the Cartesian Nightmare work I'd done in the 1990s about people constantly robbing other people's identities and professions. And because we can't preserve the identity of any being other than ourselves, such as a culture, without first admitting that identities other than ourselves exist independently of us, the rational starting point for anyone seeking to solve this problem of maintaining a Christian identity in the contemporary age and building it up, the rational starting point is that we have to admit three evident truths: that beings other than ourselves, real natures exist, we're not solipsists. Like us, the identity of such being consists in being organizational wholes made up of parts. And three, organizational unity exists in and through the harmonious relationship of the parts of an organizational whole to each other and to some chief aim, like Frank says, a crowd, or act the organization seeks to generate or cause, like building a house, extinguishing a fire, fighting crime or disease, or fostering psychological perfection. To preserve the identity of a Christian culture, we must first recognize three things. What is a Christian identity, what is a cultural identity, and how these two identities can be essentially merged to become a third identity, an organizational whole, Christian cultural identity. More, because cultural identities are cultural wholes, we cannot possibly hope to resolve such a problem without first understanding what constitutes a cultural whole. Like every organizational whole, a cultural whole is an essentially harmonious relationship existing within some multitude of parts to cooperate to effect some common chief aim or end or good. This is precisely what the induction is related to in real induction in an organization. You sense harmony. If there is no harmony, there's no organization. Right? The harmony exists, and the organization exists in the harmony of its parts. But it's not the harmony of the parts, it's the cause that's generating the harmony of the parts by relating the beginning of the organization, what's developed through the people who are forming it, to some chief aim, perfection that they're trying to secure. Organizational principle, hence cultural wholes are essentially action improving wholes. Organizational principles that exist within other organizations, natures, that incline to bring these somewhat harmoniously existing organizations to more harmonious, better, more perfect operation. Cultures, in short, are principles, qualities that exist within organizations, you say essential properties, that by nature incline to generate within those organizations firmly possessed healthy operation. As Mortimer J. Adler has well observed in his classic God and the Professors article, like the health and disease of the body, cultural health consists in organizational health, the harmonious functioning of its parts, and cultures die from lack of harmonious functioning of these same parts. In relationship to the chief topic of this paper in this Congress, the crucial point to understand about cultures is that while by nature they incline to improve health, perfect the organizations within which they exist, organizational cultures can become diseased. And when they do, the culture inclines to cause the organization to become diseased, die from within. Equally crucial to understand is that human cultures are chiefly caused within human faculties by repeated acts of human nature, and more precisely by repeated acts of human faculty psychology. Deny the faculty psychology, you deny the locus of the habits by means of which you develop cultural and organizational identity. You can't have an organizational identity within the knowing subject. Wherever human culture exists, an image of the human soul and the way it inclines to operate exists. Human cultures exist within the habits, talents, virtues of its members. A totally untalented, non-virtuous human organizational culture is an anarchic, non-existent one. These habits, talents, virtues, moreover, exist within human faculties, and these human faculties exist within a human soul, naturally seeking to achieve self-perfection. I think this is one of the biggest problems within Christianity today, is a loss of an understanding of the soul, an abandonment, especially among the hierarchy of the church, all over the place. They don't believe in the existence of souls. Not in actuality. They'll give lip service to it, but they don't actually believe it. This is so true that if we study the origins of Christian culture and its educational institutions, we find that both are born of the natural human desire by the human soul to perfect itself and its operations, such as we heard in that eulogy related to Michael Mangini. Perfect itself in its operations for human beings to become happy. Indeed, Christian educational institutions like hospitals were chiefly the product of, originally brought into existence by and within Christian culture, and by a psychology peculiar to the Christian soul and its vision of happiness. Such being the case, to preserve the identity of a culture, a Christian culture, in an increasingly fragmented world, we need to understand the distinctively Christian understanding of the human soul. and of the nature of happiness that Christian psychology chiefly envisions, and preserve it. A helpful way to do this is to consider the general development of the state of Western Christian education centuries prior to the development of the first Christian universities. When we do this, we find that this education had chiefly consisted in attempts initially started by the early church fathers, and among them in the West, mainly St. Aurelius Augustine, to use the liberal arts, which these thinkers tended mistakenly to conflate with philosophy, to generate within the soul of Christian students a Christian wisdom. The chief aim of Christian education at its inception consisted mainly in pursuit of wisdom to achieve perfection in action of the human soul. During the Middle Ages, this pursuit of wisdom often became verbally expressed by the Augustinian dictum that philosophy consists in faith-seeking understanding. And the soul being perfected by this understanding tended to be considered to be an analogous transposition into Christian culture of the Socratic and Platonic teaching about the human soul, an intellect or spirit existing separate from the human body. Despite the brilliance of St. Augustine, strictly speaking, philosophy is not faith-seeking understanding. Strictly speaking, nothing akin to such a notion, such as enlightening inspiration by the gods, had been what the leading ancient Greek philosophers, especially Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and the pagan Greek Neoplatonists had chiefly understood by philosophy, which these same Greek thinkers had identified with science. Despite this fact, following the lead of St. Augustine, church intellectuals started to popularize the notion that Christian wisdom consisted in the practice of a Christian philosophy, the nature of which they did not precisely understand, by a unifying cause, the human soul, which they also did not precisely understand. Consequently, for centuries after its inception, Christian educational institutions could never adequately apply philosophy to the human soul as a proximate first principle fully to develop a Christian wisdom. Among several mistakes Augustine had made in attempting to use Greek philosophy, and especially the teaching of Plato as an apologetic in the service of Christian wisdom, was that he never essentially connected the human soul to the human body as its intrinsic animating principle, nor to the bodily senses in one act of personal knowledge and of a philosophical scientific act of knowing. While he had recognized the human soul to be connected to the human body in some intimate way, he did not tend to consider the human soul to be the generating principle of life, growth, and development existing within the human body, or at least not in a coherent way, right? Nor did he consider the act of philosophy science to be the act of what Orthodox Christianity considers to be the whole person of a psychosomatic composite. Furthermore, unlike Aristotle, Augustine did not in principle tend to divide the soul into higher and lower faculties, participating in intellectual and sensory reason. Although he did have this hierarchy, still, he wasn't able to connect it to the body in relationship to a psychosomatic unit. He tended to consider the human senses and the human body to distract from knowing activity. Knowing activity being more or less completely an act of the intellect considered as a whole, which he considered to be an entirely work of a separated human soul, not of the human person as a composite of soul and body. The body tended to get in the way of knowledge, even though at times, like in the Contract Academicos, he talks about the fact, hey, that you look at the stick in the water and that's the way it should be, you know. Still, there's an inconsistency and incoherence in its application of the thought. One effect of St. Augustine's misunderstanding of the nature of ancient Greek philosophy, Christian philosophy, and the human soul was that at its inception, in its educational principles, Catholic Christian education in the West was born in a somewhat unhealthy condition. It was founded upon a devastating mistake of organizational misunderstanding, self-misunderstanding, which essentially prevented it from comprehending how human reason could function both abstractly as a contemplative or speculative scientific intellect, and concretely as a command and control prudential reason. Despite the fact that Augustine was an intellectual genius and recognized the influence of human reason, over the human appetites and emotions. Augustine's psychology provided no adequate explanation of how human reason can straddle both speculative and practical activity, so as to function as a principle of speculative and practical science and generate both the human intellectual virtue of speculative wisdom, metaphysics, and the moral habit of practical wisdom, prudence, ethics. Unhappily, this flaw in Augustinian psychology of the human person continued to influence Christian education from the start of the Christian West until the Christian universities of today. And due to the post-Reformation fracture of Christendom and the development of the inception of the falsely so-called 18th century Western Enlightenment, the influence of this flawed psychology in the form of secularized Augustinian theology, masquerading as the whole of human philosophy and science, has become especially pernicious in our time. No one can expect to be wrong about human nature and the way it generates action, especially related to it as an organizational whole, and expect to be right about human education. Yet Augustine's mistaken teachings about the nature of the human soul and what Aristotle called the form became entrenched within Christian education for 9 centuries, until St. Thomas started to challenge these mistakes so as to provide principles upon which a more perfectly healthy Christian organizational and educational psychology could be formed. So, for example, in his commentary on the De Trinitate Boethius, Book 1, Chapter 5, he indicates that the several liberal arts do not sufficiently divide philosophy. You can't specify philosophy in terms of the liberal arts. I call this initial misunderstanding a devastating mistake because it's the sort of error to which Aristotle had referred in his De Caelo, Book 1, Chapter 5, when he wrote about small mistakes in the beginning, eventually leading to bigger mistakes later on. Like all education, Christian education consists in organizational activity. Christian education is organizational education of the human person, of numerically one psychosomatic unit performing many intellectual and sensory acts through many facultative habits and acts of one body-soul composite, one human person. Christian psychology of the human person does not understand a human being to be a spirit or an essentially separate intellect, intimately connected to a human body as an external observer or motor. Nor does it conceive a human being to be an animal dispossessed of an intellectual soul. Like Aristotle, it considers a human being to be a soul, body, a hylomorphic unit. While St. Thomas Aquinas considers human reason to be a faculty of an immortal human soul, he maintains the specific difference of a human being resides in the genus animal, as I said the other day, in talking about Max Weismann, not in the genus spirit. Human beings do not belong to the genus spirit. We are not differentiated on a genus by being on the lowest level of intellectual spirit, being the dumbest of angels. So essentially, we belong to the highest rank within the genus animal, the qualitative maximum, leaders, rulers in and of the animal genus, which is specifically divided into rational and irrational. St. Thomas locates our specific difference in an otherness within the sensitive or animal part of the intellectual soul. In the Summa, Part 1, Question 3, Respondia. In the case of the human soul, he understands the soul's relation to an animal body to consist in essentially connecting through human sense faculties like memory and imagination of an animal body, an immortal intellectual soul and its activities to the whole human person to sense reality. He maintains that doing so enables the animal genus to become perfectly itself. The sensitive soul, the generic part of human nature, causes animal rationality, a reason in touch with reality, not a disembodied or abstract rationality, to overflow into the appetitive part of the soul and through its activity into the whole of material creation. During the 13th century, St. Thomas Aquinas recognized that only a faculty of psychology, and especially recognition of the faculty of sentient particular reason, in touch with sense reality, can, in principle, enable development of the kind of self-understanding human beings, acting persons, capable of generating healthy educational institutions, colleges and universities, that produced what C.S. Lewis called men with chests. Unhappily, since the time of St. Thomas and Lewis, Christian educational institutions have largely lost their self-understanding of the nature of the human soul, and that their chief aim as institutes of higher education is essentially to help bring to operational perfection in their students the psychological faculties of the human soul. As St. Thomas has described these, while helping students to become employed, get a job, is a noble activity, it's not the chief activity of a university in general or of a Christian university especially. Properly understood, all university education chiefly aims at generating wisdom within faculties of the human soul to bring into being men and women of perfect virtue, the best of world leaders, including the best of job creators, employers, not employees. It doesn't chiefly consist in aping utopian socialist propaganda and vocational training institutes so as to produce technocrats to bring into existence a new world order run by robots directed by enlightened artificial intelligence plutocrats. Absent a human soul within which human psychological faculties and habits exist, no human talent or virtue can exist. More, no intrinsic principle of causation exists within human beings for which we can be honored, praised, or shamed, rewarded, ignored, or punished for generating human activities like science and wisdom, prudence and foolishness, virtue and vice. If the human soul does not exist as the chief proximate cause of science and wisdom, prudence and foolishness, virtue and vice, where do these qualities exist? If they do not exist within the talents and flaws and virtues and vices of scientists, if the psychological qualities, habits of scientists are not the chief cause of science, what is? If, as some contemporary scientists falsely so-called proclaim, science is an aimless pursuit having nothing to do with perfecting the human person, then contemporary science is essentially an anarchic, humanly worthless, and universities that chiefly aim to produce scientists chiefly aim at generating anarchists, men without chests. If science has nothing to do with perfecting the human soul and the psychological health of our human faculties, then essentially, at best, the chief aim of contemporary science appears to be reduced to producing tools with the chief aim of perfecting tools. If such be the case, then, as Gilson tells us in his work entitled Terrors of the Year 2000, the father of postmodern man's existential project, and with it, the contemporary Christian university, is Sisyphus, not Prometheus, as postmodernists have thought. While Gilson had claimed that our contemporary destiny had become the absurd and truly exhausting task of perpetual self-invention without model, purpose, or rule, our contemporary situation appears to be worse than he thought. Absent any soul, faculties, or natural abilities, because even tool makers presuppose tool users to make their natures intelligible, because in the contemporary world of enlightenment intellectual, we human beings have no nature, we cannot be tool users, and hence we cannot be self-inventors, or any kind of inventor or tool maker. We cannot have Prometheus or Sisyphus as our father and model to imitate. Even exercise of acts of perpetual boredom exceeds our natural abilities, since we have no such abilities. By making the mistake of imitating the European Enlightenment's reduction of the whole of science to productive knowledge generated by abstract collectivist neo-Gnostic spirit or general will, aiming at perfecting some utopian socialist will to power over the material universe, unwittingly, most contemporary Christian universities worldwide have lost their self-understanding. Hence, to conclude, if Christian universities seriously want to preserve their identity and with it Christian culture, in an increasingly fragmented world, they need to displace as their chief measure of educational excellence the collective mass disembodied spirit and disordered understanding of scientific reason that Enlightenment intellectuals mistakenly claim always and everywhere to be the metaphysical foundation of all philosophy, science, wisdom, and truth, as Pope Benedict basically told us. They need to stop educating human beings chiefly to become a collection of mechanistically, technocratically controlled serfs. In place of this chief aim, human education, as St. John Paul II well understood, must once again recognize the distinctively Christian understanding of the human soul and of the nature of happiness that Christian psychology chiefly envisions and preserve it. They need to follow the lead of St. Thomas and return focus of Christian education on perfecting habits and talents of the individually existing acting person, perfection of the psychological faculties of the sentient embodied individual, actively engaged in free personal living relationships, must once again become the chief aim of the Christian university. Thank you. Yes, right, John, you want to do, we'll have discussion and you might want to do polling. Okay. Questions? Yes, sure. Anybody?
What's this part about the bishop having no soul? Could you expand on that?
Well, just I don't think they have an awareness of the nature of the soul that they don't have an awareness that there is an understanding of the human soul, that there is a faculty of psychology that's an essential part of Christianity that we inherited from Greek culture.
Thanks, Peter. It seems to me that when you're sitting in a seminar room with Catholics who have a decent education formation, these things seem so clear and self-evident, so obvious that we don't want the plutocratic robot. I don't know, that nice phrase you had about the kind of socialist.
Technocrat.
Yeah, that was a good phrase. And we're all looking at each other and saying, of course, this is ridiculous. Once the Catholic education gets institutionalized in a bureaucratic, managerial, liberal, now globalist culture, with all the, temptations to prestige and all the sort of necessary goods of effectiveness, as McIntyre says, the need for, division, the need for infrastructure, all the things that sort of are practical. As soon as that happens, when the institution gets big and large, prestigious, and complex, it just seems to me that regardless of how pure and forceful your understanding is, your vision of the education, it just gets compromised, It's sort of like, the practical structure that we're dealing with takes what we have and just turns it into something else. And there isn't anyone who could oversee that and prevent it. It just sort of happens by a war of attrition. Then you have the new institutions that develop. They're pure and they're marginalized, like Wyoming Catholic. And they have a certain amount of integrity precisely because they're marginalized, because they don't have to listen to the bureaucratic rules. But as soon as we get bigger and extend, you can see what would happen, right? And then all of a sudden you're finding your vision and your witness and your curriculum and sort of compromise. So I'm just wondering, like, the relationship between the truths you're talking about, which are obviously true, to the kind of seemingly the problem of the practical application. What happens? It's sort of a Marxist analysis, right? The structure itself sort of changes the idea. Yeah. I've never figured out a solution to this. I don't know what the solution is.
You can't work within the old order.
Of course.
I remember asking Max Weisman what was, because Adler was constantly trying to work within the educational order, reforming education, doing all these projects. And Max said something to the effect that he, his final thought was that it had to be imploded. Basically, the whole thing has to be taken down and started over, and something else developed in its place. And this is one of the other reasons why this is a kind of ragamuffin type of movement, that we're we're in that situation where we're at the tail end of the medieval university and so on. A whole new institution, in a way, going back to Alcuin, so there are different associations, different organizations that have to be formed outside of the traditional kinds of learning, and from seeing the way in which the social relationships have been developing and where the leaders are, that appears to me to be in relationship to business institutions and things like Peter DeMarco is doing with priority thinking and executive coaching, organizational development. What you need is this classical understanding that philosophy is a psychological activity. You've got to get rid of the notion that philosophy is this kind of abstract systematic logic, and it has no way of talking to business leaders and executives, because what you really need in executive institutions where people are working with IT and digital, this digital world, is people who have this ability to be able quickly to make decisions, right, and to remain calm, right, and to be able to have people who are talented develop an understanding of this faculty psychology within which they are actually working, like this notion of cogitative reason, particular reason, where you're actually you sense the good, you sense your personal abilities. A person in business, this is normal, and this is the way they tend to look at the world. And you can take the same 3 courses that most Catholic schools, Christian universities teach, to students: a philosophy of the human person, metaphysics and ethics, that the Vatican Council was recommending, God, the soul in the world, and you can bring them into the training, because business organizations can no longer turn to universities to get people who are literate and trained in liberal arts to become good decision makers, because they've destroyed their programs. So they are, by necessity, as they grow larger and have to be increasingly dependent upon making smart decisions, they have to have people who actually are classically trained, classically educated. Right? Not necessarily totally with St. Thomas, because you can get a great amount of stuff from Plato. You can get it. You can get it from reading the ancient historians and so forth as well. Wealth of knowledge about human psychology, but we have to transition. We have to convert our allies to recognize, hey, Thomism really is not the systematic logic. Thomism has this rich awareness of human psychology that is the first principle. First principles mean more than logical premises. That's an analogous transposition of this initial understanding of principles simply as a starting point, of being, becoming, or knowing. Right? And the chief principle of philosophical and scientific activity is a talented person. That you need for organizational development. These qualities, to me, as far as I can say, they fit in perfectly with executive training. And the major international business organizations need executive training programs, institutes, and that's the future of employment for people that are classically trained philosophers and classically trained educators. And this is one of the reasons we formed this organization. I think Curtis saw this, we saw this is coming. Thank you.
Do I go now?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Peter,
Yeah.
50 years ago, the Lando Lakes meeting occurred. The 6 leading, so-called leading universities self-selected themselves and started something that we're still living with. When you look around at organizations like the building we're in, where you have what used to be simply a one-act show, training crews, now reaching out and having seminars, perhaps training 40 people, and offering degrees.
Right.
Maybe even degrees in bioethics and so on. Do you think that there's some hope that, and also this sense of understanding, do you think that there's some hope that these developments will lead to the kind of training that you're looking for?
Oh, yeah, that's one of the reasons why we became affiliated with Holy Apostles College and Seminary, precisely because you had the people there with the talents to understand how to use the new technologies to communicate, right? I remember that Land O'Lakes meeting, George Kelly, Monsignor Kelly was a good friend of mine. I remember him. Yeah, I loved him because he worked like Jimmy Cagney, when he came down the steps, among other things. But, he recognized that this was a kind of devastating effect. And I said that the first day we had this meeting, one of the brilliant things I noticed about St. John's years ago, and even Fordham, was they recognized that metaphysics was something that should be mandatory study for people in business. Because they sensed something about it that connected to it was this awareness of organizations and how they operated. So I think if you get the clear articulation of the principles, right, that are connected, properly understood in relationship to induction, and how philosophical induction requires this ability to sense the principles that are causing or generating action. Philosophy, as this psychological activity, becomes something that is an essential element for people who are engaged in business activity. And as these people become more increasingly influential in the world in which we live, that the Jesuits, having abandoned their apostolate to the one percenters, the Aquinas Leadership Institute International has to take that over, more or less. So we can offer an alternative.
I think it kind of leads right into what you're talking about. Is originally it's inductive.
Yes, yeah,
inductive. What do we call it? Reason? No, inductive reality.
Yeah, well,
what was the term you used?
I tend to use induction. St. Thomas uses abstraction.
Oh, yeah, okay. So anyway, so we have this process of inductive reality. Inductive reality, I think is what you originally called it.
Well, analysis starts with an awareness of an organizational whole.
Yes, scientific side. In the example you gave, you walk into a room, you see somebody who can see the parts in the whole and sensing whether there really is a good integration between the parts in the whole. And when I think of that, I think of organizations, they talk about principles. I think you're talking about, there are certain principles which you look for to be present for the parts to continually align themselves with the whole and the whole to align with the parts.
Right.
So there's certain like teleological principles, other kinds of practical principles, practical intellect kinds of things. And I think a lot of those things could be described in some in a generic kind of way.
Yeah. Now
what are the principles?
Yeah. Well, now even here with and Pablo was talking about this. People in business, when they get academics going in to deal with them in relationship to leadership and what they can do to help them out, they're taking these modernist sociological principles that are totally worthless for helping them develop this kind of self-understanding. And they put these people in middle management, and they create these gluts, that prevents them. First of all, if you don't have that principle of cogitative reason, that ability to sense your own personal abilities, right, and what you can contribute to an act, you have no sense of individual freedom and distributive justice. You have to get rid of the notion of distributive justice, and you have to reduce the whole of justice to commutative. The commutative justice, and you can't reward people on the basis of inequality of talents. That's an absurd. It's not even comprehensible to these people. Because those inequalities are based upon oppression. You create this historical narrative.
Principles have to be mystic.
Right.
anthropological principles.
Yeah, so what you have is the people in business start to talk the language of their opponents, of the people who basically are out to destroy them and don't have no appreciation of what they do, like values.
Yeah.
Everything.
And what I find is that the upper management folks have never been taught the process. So it's kind of like, well, work is a process, but there's a disconnect between the upper management and the people actually doing the work. Right. They don't really see the responsibility to organize the work. They kind of think there's their thing up here. You don't own that. The work it takes to properly organize things in a way that's
one of the things St. Thomas says about this, which is terrific, and understanding the nature of prudence and its relationship to these other qualities that any organization has temperance. You have to undergo pain, difficulty, and face dangers and so on. Is the fact that what moral awareness creates it doesn't teach you how to be talented. It's not going to teach you how to be a better singer, or a better dancer, or a better football player, and so forth. But it's going to enable you to avoid making the stupid choice, so that you don't engage in the kind of healthy activities and operations that will enable you to perfect your activity long term.
Yeah.
So you're not going to get in trouble.
Business is always working on a team. Everything you do affects everybody else.
Right.
So
that's the moral.
In a certain sense, so it's you have to develop the capability as a group.
Yeah. And you have to understand the kind of team, the kind of crowd, the kind of organization genus to which you belong, and that you're simultaneously existing within this wide variety of genera and species. So if you've got a Darwinian notion of species, for example, which is nominalistic, there's no way in which you're going to be able to make this distinction. No way you're going to be able to figure out how the human heart can both belong to the biological genus and the medical genus. For example, it becomes impossible. They can't make these distinctions.
We go back to this original question. Institutions, they commonly go. Recently, IT guys might want to jump in on this. I'm going to be inclined to approach that question. Probably complexity theory or chaos theory. Institutions will go along unless the law of entropy kind of says something, okay? Unless there's this constant influx of fresh ideas and fresh products, okay? The thing against your growing inside. And you get to a point where the implosion effect happens, it just evolves. I personally think it's always a hopeful sign that universities, be they Catholic or public, are close to that point. Okay, people can't change kind of thing. Right. When that explodes, what you have to really have to apologetics, the sharp person, the future leaders, the future leader vision, and so forth. What they're waiting for is what they call the butterfly effect, which is this. But things start to go big, any idiot can spot that. But the real genius, we look at here's the Ruffles. I personally think the Ruffles, after coming from conferences, young people, virgins, and so forth, although the millennials are a hard bunch. Yeah. Sometimes they should just skip it, okay? But there's a point. They don't know what we're talking about here. They don't think in terms of institutions at all. They don't even think in terms of organizations. They think of things like improving, emerging. They have their own set of language, okay? And I think even a Catholic millennial we develop would have your problem also solved. Yeah. And we start forming something else. Yeah. The problem is the solution to that. It's the emergence of the new.
So I see the university pretty much as finished. This 18th, 19th century university, it's over. And the people that are in the administration trying to figure new ways, and we're going to create new universities and so forth. They're barking up the wrong tree. Because based upon Aristotle's notion that the art of use governs the art of production, which is true, and the art of sailing governs the art of shipbuilding, except to the extent that your art of shipbuilding becomes so technologically advanced that you no longer need the art of sailing. because you've incorporated that into the design mechanism. It becomes, you have the driverless cars, for example. So increasingly, as the arts develop with respect to these technologies, the tool tends to absorb the classical art into it, and the university is not what increasingly becomes required in that kind of situation is classical liberal arts education.
We probably have all seen this poll that has just started circulating. And I just found it in the last couple of days. We're now up to 58% of Republicans are saying that universities are damaging society. You know about Heterodox Academy?
I saw those numbers too.
The Heterodox Academy is now, I think, got close to 1,000 signatories, but it was started by a social psychologist, John Haidt, who's written a bunch of popular books about this. He's in Stern School at NYU. But it scores all 150 top colleges and I think 150 universities and 50 colleges. University of Chicago, 100 is a perfect score, and University of Chicago is 98 at the top of the list. Harvard is 16. And so this is now sort of spreading out as public information with editorials, and it got to the point now where you can poll on these topics. So what happened? This was actually already occurring 10 years ago. So Columbia University, for instance, which I know fairly well, and Brown as well, decided that they were no longer going to be able to get kids from America that have to go to the rest of the world. And a number of people have started businesses trying to basically get the sons and daughters of the oil and other elites, Russian and other elites. So we're in a radical transformation here now. Peter's exactly right. I mean, the 19th century Cornell, Johns Hopkins, German-derived universities are dead.
Apply Notre Dame. Apply Notre Dame.
Notre Dame is going through some radical transformations. We're actually working closely with Notre Dame.
In 1990,
What about the football team?
in 1997, 98, I wrote this book called Masquerade of the Dreamwalkers, a prophetic theology from the Cartesians to Hegel. And the last chapter I entitled Dirty Dancing, Higher Education as Enlightened Swindling, and talked about the crucial need to get foreign students into the universities to be able to, because they were exhausting their ability to deceive students into accepting the large tuitions for not getting
the game is over. So Peter's exactly right. We're poised at the right moment to do something with this.
We're the butterflies. Domestic butterflies.
Peter, how do you propose to teach executives of business people to sense properly?
To sense properly?
Yeah. I mean, I understand the theory. And I know there's leadership institutes that will give you the principles, et cetera. But I think you're talking about something different. You're talking about the actual ability to do it. Poetic.
Yeah, the ability to do it. The ability to do it. You don't teach them to do it, strictly speaking. You teach them that these are the people that they have to hire in the first place. You have to be very careful about that. The people, they understand this already. They need team players,
Right.
And they look for this, right?
And they measure it.
And they
sociologists or survey people come in.
Right. Yeah. This is to a certain extent what they do. But it's not really that much of a conscious awareness on their part. For example, that they have a moral culture. They recognize that they have some sort of an organizational culture. They've got a mission statement, for example. But they don't see that as moral activity. They don't see that as ethical behavior. They think of ethical behavior in terms of compliance, right? They bring in people to teach them how, teaching them ethics to them means making sure that you're not violating the laws. They don't tend to think of ethics in terms of having what they already do possess. Okay, that what they would identify as instinct, the instinctive ability to recognize whether somebody is a crook with whom you're dealing.
You're talking about relational skills.
Relational, yeah.
There's an interesting book.
They don't tend to think of ethics in those terms.
Rare Leadership by this guy, Jim Wilder, and he talks about fast track brain skills. This is all, he's a neuroscientist, and slow track. Very interesting. He says the slow track skills, it's literally slow track. It's actually slower synapse, whatever.
Right.
They are the managerial effects, goods of effectiveness, efficiency, managerial skills, compliance. And some people are geniuses for that.
Right.
The fast track skills, he says, are the instant intuitive brain mechanisms or organic relations in the brain that end up instilling trust, affirming others, relating well, sizing up a situation immediately, and acting decisively for the good, not for self-interest. Almost, so you'd say, moral skills.
Yeah.
And he says in this book that he's, talking to a lot of businessmen. If those moral skills are preeminent and excelled in, all the others come, they follow. If you put the slow track first, the fast track never come, and then it's bad.
Does he have the data to support that? Did he actually reach out to business leaders?
Yes.
Tie them up to electrical encephalogram and determine the brains were slow or fast?
No, not that
I
way.
mean, I'm a little skeptical about that. I'm not a cognitive scientist, but I'd like to see a cluster of data over a long period of time where he took individuals from the field, hooked them up to an EEG or something, and said, "Oh, you got a slow track neuron," without pissing anybody off too.
No, there's a certain empirical data associated with the fast track, slow track differences.
But it's not neurological. We can't do that neurological.
Well, where's the proof for it? I mean,
Well, there are other kinds of experiments.
There is, but listen,
it's not about as good as the thing I was told when I graduated high school. If you're a C-average student, you're going to end up being in management. The students are going to work for you. It's like,
That's like the Myers-Briggs.
Yeah.
They're nine GJ.
But the main point though is not all. The main point is that leaders who have relational skills, who know how to relate to somebody on a personal level, and instill trust, affirm them, not treat them like crap, not treat them like a cop, have an actual skill of relating, which causes trust, which causes a sense of joy being in the business. The other skills that are usually seen to be as most important will come. Not like you have to have training, of course, but the priorities are all backwards. He says.
But you have to do that for the whole organization.
That's right.
That's how we organize
But
this.
this is where you need.
Everybody does.
This is where you need people like Pete DeMarco and the Aquinas, that have been dealing with organizations. Like Pete works with AIG, training Peter Hancock, executives, right?
Yeah, I work with a lot of them too.
And
that's basically what I do, is organize governance and best practices.
So they already recognize that the people within their organization, first of all, have to have the talent to be able to do this or that job.
Mm-hmm.
But they also have to have an emotional disposition that enables them within the individual situation, not, as Donald Trump says, to choke. Right? Because they have to focus attention on this is what ethics actually deals with. You're not going to train people how to build bridges or whatever. But what you're about to have to do is, what you will do is train them like Rudy Giuliani to stay calm when the World Trade Center is getting bombed, for example. So
I will say that there are existing things within organizations that work well. For instance, the Deming approach, and building upon that. And actually, when I look at all the frameworks for best practice on how to organize IT these days, they're all based on Deming total quality approach, which is very human I think Thomistic human friendly. Because the people as subsidiarity, people close to the work, help make decisions, accountability, ownership close to the work. There are certain things where you can look for certain principles being present and actually being implemented in an organization.
What we're forgetting out of this conversation is 60%, I think that's right, of the business organization in America have probably 20 or less employees. So when we start this conversation, we're thinking of AT&T. First of all, the way things are going right now, in most corporations in the future, there will be no middle management. You don't need middle management anymore. I think we will gradually see the size of large companies. Right now, you can walk into manufacturing places and see that manufacturing being done that 15 years ago would take a couple hundred employees. Now you got maybe 10 people who are technicians and computer trained guys. So that's going to disappear. All this stuff that we're worried about.
You need project managers and stuff like that.
Yeah, you're going to have that. But a lot of this stuff is going to radically change. And on top of that, my millennial friends coming in. Again, I think they will be communicating in a whole different way. And I don't know what that is, but anybody's teaching them right now.
Yeah, a lot of them want to. Yeah. Put it that way. They want to be cowboys and all this kind of stuff.
Well,
you got to get them organized. There's no magic bullet.
They're going to self-organize. They told you that.
What's that?
They will self-organize.
Yeah, that's what they're saying.
No, they won't self-organize.
Well, principles will always come to love. I mean,
what's that?
Man will naturally self-organize. That's holistic, you know.
I think, what is it, the law of
What happened
inertia is I think tend to just.
What happened to
Unless you place the word into it.
This development of prudence within the organization is crucial with respect to the other cardinal moral virtues. Because what prudence enables you to do is, like St. Thomas says, the right desire is indicated by the right relationship to the aim, to the end.
So you have to see where you're at. You don't want to go from here, say, I'm going to go from here to here in one step. That's not.
So you have to
That's a bad idea.
you have to have people who employees who are able to restrain their pleasure, pain, appetite.
Somebody has to be there to stand for, to improve
But
the
what prudence,
That's teleological.
the function that prudence performs is to be able to relate right reason of the means to the end. So you know on a sense level.
Yeah.
Within the circumstances. So the eight conditions, the eight circumstances of an act, right, become the specification for the moral rightness of the act.
Yeah.
Right. St. Thomas says that the individual act, right, that the circumstance, well, the circumstances are always included in it. As part of determining its nature, but sometimes the alteration of one circumstance changes the species on an individual level. That's kind of difficult passage. What the heck is he talking about? And he's indicating that your liberty, the voluntariness of an act is not determined until you understand your abilities within this individual circumstance to make the right decision.
Right.
And so not choking requires not only that you can remain calm because you have the courage, you have that emotional stability and that irascible appetite, but also you don't lose your head.
But yeah, the corporation almost has to become an organ.
That's right.
In a certain way.
It has to
be able to sense, know what drivers, what events are affecting it. How am I going to respond to that in a timely way?
That's why you need female executives to do that.
What's that?
That's why you need female executives.
Yeah. Well, they have their place. They definitely do. I won't say I won't go. There's pluses and minuses like everything.
I think ultimately, if we want to get to the cogitative reason here, which I think is the salient point, it has to start in a liberal arts sense from grammar. That is, we're talking about structure or order of something. The structure or order of our languages are the formal cause of anything that we're able to say to each other today. And and of course that's elementary, or trivial, if you like, but what's very important to understanding poetics, which, as you mentioned, any of these business problems are essentially viewing the thing not necessarily as an organism, well, if you like, you could call it that, but it's essentially as a poem, right? And that means not only being trained in how to read it, which is grammar, but in how to speak about it in a shared language, which is rhetoric. All that is liberal arts. And yes, it's not going to happen at Cornell, it's not going to happen anywhere. Right now, it's happening online.
I completely agree with you. Let me give you an example. So I teach classes on how to improve organizations and stuff. And one of the biggest benefits of them coming to a class to improve is understanding the terms and concepts of what they mean, so they can actually talk to each other.
Definitions.
Because, you know, and that's one of the biggest reasons I get business, is because a lot of these things have spread throughout the industry, and they have people go to work, and they're doing ITIL, which is this one framework, and people have got all these terms, and they're talking about stuff, and the new people don't even understand what they're talking
Well,
about.
what does ITIL stand
So they have,
Yeah.
it stands for IT Infrastructure Library. You gotta understand the, you know, the history of how people got that name in order to make sense out of it.
And if you don't do that, then the structure will
You're right, so
technology
that
itself.
is absolutely, you know, you've gotta understand common terms.
Right.
In order to be able to communicate.
Otherwise, you don't go into the same genus.
Yeah.
We can take a break for a few minutes here. They should have some more refreshments over coffee and tea. Hopefully they-